Do Shinto practitioners use special symbolism in personal or private rituals?
Many Japanese households have a special corner dedicated to the kami. A miniature shrine building. Kami dana, at which worshippers pray daily, is placed on a shelf or table. For special occasions they will go to the actual shrine. But everyday reverence to the kami happens at home. People can purchase these charming miniature shrines, some done up in exquisitely fine architectural detail, at religious goods stores in any Japanese city or at some of the larger shrines. Worshippers who get them from shrine shops often prefer to purchase them at shrines to which their families have ancestral connections. Priests often visit parishioners to dedicate their new home shrines, and sometimes make annual house visits for brief renewal ceremonies. People with more ample homes and yards might afford larger outdoor miniature shrines called yashikigami, kami of the home. Miniature shrines range from simple and affordable to finely wrought and costly. Business establishments, restaurants, police stations, and bridges on ocean-going ships, for example, might also have a kami dana to which the staff make daily offerings. Many miniature shrines have their own tiny torii gates and shimenawa. In addition, worshippers often bring small votive offerings when they visit local shrines. A popular offering is the miniature torii gate on which devotees write names and prayers of petition before hanging it on a rack along with hundreds of others like it at the shrine.
Did Shinto tradition spread beyond Japan?
Shinto has gone as far as Japanese emigration and military expansion have carried that ancient tradition. You'll see the occasional Shinto shrine in various parts of the Pacific Basin even now. Reminders of a time when Japan projected its imperial presence beyond its shores, where Japanese communities have taken root and continue to grow, especially during the last 50 years or so. Older people especially take comfort in celebrating at the nearest shrine for festivals. But on the whole, Shinto has remained about as purely Japanese a phenomenon as one can imagine. Even in parts of the United States, for example, where now sizable communities of Japanese descent make their homes, traditional Shinto priests are exceedingly rare. Some suggest that Shinto anywhere but in Japan is a contradiction in terms. Shinto remains, ideally, a tradition inseparable from the very soil of Japan and its sacred streams, groves, and mountains.
What are the Dead Sea Scrolls?
In the spring of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd, Muhammad Adh discovered 11 ancient leather scrolls in a cave located in the cliffs above the northeastern corner of the Dead Sea. The 11 so-called Dead Sea Scrolls comprise 7 distinct manuscripts, through the work of E. L. Skinnick and other authorities. The 11 scrolls have been authenticated as genuine documents of roughly the 2nd century BCE to the time of the unsuccessful Jewish revolt against Rome, CE 66 to 70. The manuscripts were written variously in Hebrew and Aramaic. They include portions of several of the books of the Old Testament, Apocrypha, prayers, hymns, commentaries, and rules. The most important set is the Manual of Discipline. Between 1949 and 1956, archaeological exploration of the area west of the Dead Sea was carried out by G. Lancaster Harding and Father Roland de Vaux. The two men explored the original cave and more than 200 others, finding numerous additional fragments of scrolls and other evidence of human occupancy. Most of these caves are located in the vicinity of Khirbet, Arabic for ruin, Qumran, itself less than a mile south of the original cave, and in the ravine of Wadi Murabat some 10 miles farther south. The manuscripts discovered at Wadi Murabat are very important in that, unlike those at Khirbet Qumran, they indicate that the Hebrew Bible had reached its final form by about 140 CE. The older Khirbet Qumran biblical manuscripts reveal a scriptural text that was still evolving. The discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls stand among the greatest finds in the history of modern archaeology. The scrolls shed much light on the religious and political life of the Jewish people in the centuries just before and after the time of Christ. In addition, the documents are of great importance for the understanding of early Christianity. The biblical scrolls antedate the earliest extant Hebrew text by about 1,000 years. Fragments of the Isaiah text discovered at Wadi Murabat are in complete agreement with the current biblical text, thus confirming the authenticity of later Hebrew texts.
What do Shinto practitioners believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Kami is the most important term in Shinto theology. Its general meaning is high or superior being, and it can be applied to a host of spiritual presences and powers. Every kami is said to emanate its own distinctive divine energy or force. Among the various specific designations are the following. Nature kami include the deities of mountain, agriculture, and bestowers of sustenance. Vegetation such as sacred ancient trees, and the heavenly lights. Some deities have manifested themselves as animals, such as a white bird, a deer, or a monkey. Ancestral or tutelary deities, Ujigami, include patrons of the clans. But they can also be nature kami. These are associated especially with shrines in regions once under the political control of the powerful families. As has often happened in Chinese traditions, some of Japan's kami also originated as historical figures who became deities by dint of their leadership in a clan. Large numbers of major shrines are dedicated to such figures. Other important historical kami include literary figures as well. Zoomorphic kami form another significant category, as represented, for example, by Inaries Fox. A classification of kami connected with ancestor veneration and exorcism. Are wrathful deities and malcontent spirits called Goryo or Onryo. They reflect the moral ambivalence Japanese discern in the spirit world. Popular belief holds such evil spirits responsible for disasters from earthquake and famine to war and political failure. Many of the great sacred sites enshrine tragic heroes who suffered political downfall. Some kami function as scapegoats in that they become the focus of popular blame for all manner of unhappy events. Japanese tradition sometimes identifies kami as either era wild and natural, or Nikki, placid and cultivated. In some cases separate shrines dedicated to these aspects of the same kami are located some distance apart. Another distinction is that between celestial deities, Amatsu kami, and the kami anciently associated with particular localities. Tradition portrays some kami as guests or visitors from a mysterious and faraway land called Tokoyo. Perhaps an acknowledgement of their origin in Buddhism and other imported traditions.
What is the Nicene Creed?
I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. And in one Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, the only begotten, born of the Father before all ages. Light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. Of one substance with the Father through whom all things were made. Who for us men and for our salvation, came down from heaven, and was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and Mary the Virgin, and became man. He was also crucified for us under Pontius Pilate, and suffered, and was buried. And he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he ascended into heaven, and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he will come again with glory to judge the living and the dead. And of his kingdom there will be no end. And in the Holy Spirit, the Lord and giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, who together with the Father and the Son is worshipped and glorified, who spoke through the prophets. In one, holy, Catholic, and Apostolic Church. I profess one baptism for the remission of sins. I expect the resurrection of the dead, and the life of the world to come. Amen.
What are Santos?
Walk into virtually any small neighborhood or village, church anywhere in Latin America and you will find Santos. Santos, Spanish for saints, are small carved, painted statues of holy persons specially revered because of their spiritual power and presence. You will generally see them lined up on shelves along the side walls of the church or occupying small side altars flanking the main altar. All who come to the church regularly are likely to have a particular favorite among the diminutive saints. Devotees are not shy about expressing their needs to their patrons, and these little churches are often alive with voices communicating in loud whispers every conceivable physical and spiritual need. People often light candles, soften the wax on the bottom so that they will stick to the floor, and proceed to harangue their santos with animated gestures, humbly demanding rain for the crops or asking why a sick child has not yet been healed. Santos are an important form of folk religious art that reveals a great deal about popular Christianity in the Americas. Cathedrals and wealthier churches have their equivalent of santos in their multiple side altars and shrines. But there the conversations are quieter. The candles mounted on racks, and the saints often protected behind glass.
Where do Christians live today? What are their estimated numbers?
Members of the several dozen major Christian churches and denominations live in virtually every country on the planet. As the largest single group of religious communities, people who identify themselves at least nominally as Christians number just under 2 billion. Christianity's numbers are expanding at a rate somewhat slower than that of the global Muslim community. Catholicism is the single largest Christian church, with around 1 billion members. Protestants combined number about a third of a billion, with Orthodox believers just under a quarter billion, with Russia's church the largest single body. The smallest Christian communities in major countries are those in Japan and China.
Do Confucians believe in miracles?
Some have described Confucian teaching as philosophical in content and religious in function. As such, Confucian tradition focuses on the role of humanity in the greater scheme of things. It does not deny the existence of a divine realm or the power of beings who inhabit that realm. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of each human being's full acceptance of his or her responsibility. About the rest we cannot know in detail. What we have to work with are the myriad small realities we confront every day. Countless wonders await anyone willing to observe carefully each detail of ordinary life. Confucius would not have approved of any approach to life that amounted to waiting for the gods to do what human beings alone are responsible for. As such, Confucian teaching is highly realistic. It does not deny the possibility of miracles, events beyond the ordinary. It merely suggests that people who are genuinely attentive to life as it unfolds already have more than enough to occupy them. Many devoutly religious people think of miracles as the ultimate cause for gratitude.
What do deists believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Deists call the ultimate spiritual reality Dao, the way. Long before the formal beginnings of Daoism's various movements and school, Chinese tradition used the term Dao as a general ethical notion implying the appropriate and moral way of acting. As so often happens when a religious tradition enters a new cultural setting, Buddhism's arrival in China led some thinkers to talk of a Buddhist way in contrast with which they began to define an indigenous Chinese way in the sense of religious beliefs and values. Daoist philosophers emphasized the unfathomable mystery of the Dao, but they viewed it as non-personal power rather than a personal divine entity. The religious equivalent seems to have been a deity called the Supreme Oneness, Tai Yi. The Dao De Jing's description of how the transcendent Dao became manifest suggests a type of emanation. Dao gave rise to the One, which produced the Two, and so on. That grand and uplifting description of the ultimate mystery still remained a bit too abstract for most people. As a result, when the first schools of religious Daoism began to formulate their beliefs, they naturally gravitated toward more concrete imagery. That included the deification of the individual, long believed to represent the way as an accessible teaching, namely Lao Zi. The process also led to personification of certain essential features of the mysterious Dao in the form of the heavenly triad called the Three Pure Ones. Developments of this sort multiplied, and the deities took on life stories and personalities that invited devotional interaction. In practice, the many personifications of divinity are arrayed according to an administrative structure parallel to that of the imperial bureaucracy. Religiously speaking, of course, the reality is just the other way round. The imperial institutions imitated the heavenly order of things.
What is the main source of information on Lao Zi's life?
The main source of information on Lao Zi's life is a biography written by the historian Si Ma Chen, 145–86 b. CE, in his Records of the Historian. By this time a number of beliefs about the founder of Chinese Daoism were circulating, and Si Ma Chen himself was unsure of their authenticity. The biography, in fact, contains an account of not one, but three, men called Lao Zi. The first Lao Zi was a man named Li Er or Lao Dan who came from the village of Churen in the southern Chinese state of Chu. Li Er served as historian in charge of the official archives in the Chinese imperial capital of Luoyang. He was a contemporary of Confucius and is reported to have granted an interview to the Confucian master when he came to Luoyang seeking information on the Zhou ritual. Another man identified as the founder of Daoism was Lao Lai Zi, who also came from Chu. He is designated as a contemporary of Confucius and is credited with a 15-chapter book expounding on the teachings of the Daoist school. Nothing more is known about him. According to a third account, the original Lao Zi lived 129 years after the death of Confucius. This man went by the name of Tan, the historian of Jo. Scroll volumes. Every imaginable variety of text is available in the modern 60-volume reprint of the canon. 12 subdivisions arrange the material as follows: primal revelations, talismans, scriptural interpretation, or exegesis, sacred diagrams, historical texts, ethical texts, ritual texts, practical techniques, biographical information, sacred songs, and memorials. Most of the various sects and schools of Daoism focus on one or a select few of the many possibilities the canon offers. As we shall see later, recitation or chanting of sacred texts forms an important part of some ritual observances.
What are the main architectural and ritual elements of a major Shinto shrine?
At the heart of a major shrine is a complex of 3 units called the Hongwu. For a Jingwu, Hansha for a Jinjia. This central area, all oriented to the south as in Chinese sacred structures, houses the shrine's principal deity. Within the Hongwu are the Haiden, and Hondan arranged front to rear along the south-north-central axis. The outer and most public of the spaces is called the Haiden, or worship hall, where devotees gather individually or in small groups for special blessings and other rituals. Most people who come to the shrine without prior arrangements for special ceremonial ministrations from the priestly staff perform their brief prayers in front of the Haiden. But if the staff are performing rituals inside, those outside are welcome to observe. From that hall, worshippers can look across an interior courtyard to the central structure, the Haiden or offering hall, where only the priestly staff perform more sacred rituals. From there, in turn, the celebrants can see, sometimes across yet another courtyard, the Hondan, the Shinto equivalent of the Holy of Holies. There, behind closed doors and visible to no one, the kami reside. Also on the grounds of many large shrines one may find subordinate shrines called beku, which house related major deities. Masha house lesser deities. Some shrines also have small Buddhist temples, called Jingguji, shrine temples, on the property, remnants of the ancient connections between the two traditions.
Is nonviolence particularly important in Hindu beliefs?
Leaders familiar with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. may recall that he spoke of being especially influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings on nonviolent resistance, concern for ahimsa, non-injury, including respect for all forms of life. Seems to have become an important theme in Hindu tradition following the rise of Buddhism and Jainism in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. Ahimsa ranks first among a list of 10 spiritual qualities, called yamas, or restraints. In the classical system of yoga attributed to Patanjali, avoidance of all injury in word and deed began with the rejection of Vedic sacrifice and as a central practice of small groups of ascetics and grew to include the practice of vegetarianism.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Hindu worship and prayer?
Since puja involves offerings and other uses of numerous symbolic physical substances, devotees employ quite a few ritual objects. Most are made of metals such as brass, bronze, silver, or silver plate. Objects owned by older temples may be ancient and precious works of art, but their purpose is to serve the larger ritual rather than to attract attention to themselves. Bells, sometimes with an image of the deity on the handle, summon devotees to attentiveness and announce their arrival to visit the deity. With a special long-handled spoon they offer water or ghee. And in a smaller cup with no handle they offer a drink of water. In a small cup-like lamp with a handle they burn camphor and wave it before the deity. And a multi-wicket oil lampstand provides sacred illumination. A ritual plate holds offerings of food. For some rituals a brass or bronze image of a closed lotus flower can be opened like a lotus at dawn. An image of divine disclosure. In some puja ceremonies the priest briefly places a small silver crown, like that worn by the deity, on the heads of devotees, symbolizing divine blessing.
What is religious anthropology and what questions does it ask?
Virtually all religious traditions develop in considerable detail views of what it means to be a human being. Two especially important themes stand out. First, there are questions about the origin and makeup of the human person. Stories of human beginnings muse over whether we should ascribe them to direct creation, a freak happenstance, or a long process of evolution.
Do Buddhists pray in any particular language?
Even the earliest Buddhist practice apparently did not require any particular sacred or canonical language for prayer. People recited the scriptural texts and prayed in their vernaculars. Among Theravada Buddhists, the Pali tongue, distantly related to ancient Sanskrit, has functioned something like an official or canonical language, since the Pali Canon contains their full sacred text. But Theravada Buddhists across Southeast Asia also pray in their local languages. This all seems perfectly in character for a tradition whose foundational figure taught an egalitarian way that was neither based on any one sacred source nor structured according to any ancient hierarchy. Some of the more esoteric branches of Buddhism, however, Retain the practice of using archaic texts that require special education to understand fully.
What is Neo-Confucianism?
During the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE, Confucian tradition underwent a kind of renaissance. Buddhism and Daoism had both developed into powerful influences at all levels of Chinese life and culture. A host of talented Confucian scholars reinterpreted their tradition in light of and in dialogue with Buddhist and Daoist concepts. 3 10th and 11th century scholars pioneered what has come to be known in China as learning of principle. Li Shui, and beyond Asia as Neo-Confucianism. Sun Fu, 922-1057, Shikia, 1005-45, and Hu Yuan, 933-1059, transformed and revitalized the Confucian curriculum, thus paving the way for later teachers in their movement. Zhou Dunyi, 1017-73, continued the dramatic changes by developing Li as a spiritual or metaphysical principle rather than as simply a term for propriety in relationships and ritual. He and his successors expanded Confucian teaching into a full-scale cosmological system. Zhu Xi, 1130-1200, is the Thomas Aquinas of the school in the sense that he synthesized the teachings of his predecessors into his own carefully coordinated system. Zhu Xi became a sort of lightning rod for subsequent generations of scholars, all of whom had to account for his pioneering thought one way or another.
What is negative mysticism?
Certain Christians believe in the absolute unknowability of God. To them, even the Trinity fails substantially to capture or transmit the true nature of what they consider to be a God beyond God, a mystical, indistinct presence. For such believers, God can be known only by following a negative path that treats God as a divine mystery, eternally dark and invisible to human beings. The closest we can come to knowing God is through the love and goodness that is revealed to humankind by God's own action. An early exponent of this belief was Pseudo-Dionysius, who envisioned a superessential Godhead distinctive from all positive terms ascribed to God. Later, in the 14th century, the English author of The Cloud of Unknowing advocated a negative path to God. Today, the practice of negative mysticism is not widespread, but some Christians find it helpful to imagine what God is not in their quest to understand God as He is. Some refer to this as apophatic mysticism, to distinguish it from the cataphatic tradition, in which proponents believe one can make more affirmative statements of mystical experience.
What moral options are available as solutions means to salvation, in other words?
Everything from altruistic service to others to the pursuit of enlightened self-interest. From quiet contemplation to extroverted worship. And from active cultivation of good deeds to hopeful resignation in the face of a foreordained outcome.
How do Christians view Christianity's relationship to other traditions?
Three major issues are especially important here. First is the notion that Christianity completes, supersedes, or abrogates Judaism. Ancient messianic expectation found its mark in Jesus, Christians believe, thereby rendering Judaism historically irrelevant. Second, Christians believe that in Jesus God has granted the final and definitive revelation. Any post-Christian claims to prophetic authority are therefore unacceptable and not to be believed. Islam is the most obvious example of a claim to prophetic revelation after Jesus. So it is not surprising that the history of Christian-Muslim relations has often been stormy. Third, personal assent to the divine revelation embodied in Jesus is essential to salvation. So that only those who so believe can hope to be rewarded in the hereafter. For many Christians, it simply does not matter that most human beings through the course of history have never heard of Jesus. In this instance, many Christians have in mind not only the 80% of humanity that are not Christian, but even some of their fellow Christians whose beliefs they consider flawed or incomplete. Such exclusive views are hardly unique to Christianity. But many Christian groups recently have begun to respond to the reality of the world as it is. With all its religious wealth, by understanding that very diversity as an essential ingredient in the divine plan. From this perspective, it is no longer possible to assert simply and categorically that one segment of humanity is assured of salvation while another segment is lost virtually by an accident of birth.
What does the term Babylonian exile, or captivity, refer to?
The kingdom of Judah had come under military and political pressure in the late 700s BCE. Around the time of the fall of the northern kingdom. Some southern kings even paid tribute as vassals to Assyria. In the year 597 BCE, the Babylonians, successors to the Assyrians as the major regional power, were closing in on Jerusalem. Though the city would hold out for another 10 years. The invaders captured and deported to Mesopotamia a number of leading Jews. In 587/6 BCE, the Babylonians laid final siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple. They and other Middle Eastern powers had found it useful to take important Jews into exile. The better to demoralize the subject peoples and ensure the success of the conquering regime. Exact numbers are impossible to reconstruct. But the total deportation seems to have uprooted as many as 20,000 people. Since only the poorest and least educated were left behind. The exile amounted to a virtually total elimination of Jewish presence in Jerusalem and its environs. The good news was that the community would realize the possibility of taking root in a new land. Prophets preached a message of encouragement and survival. Devising a whole new exilic theology built around the hope of restoration and return. Enter the Achaemenid Persian Empire stage left, exit Babylon stage right. Jewish fortunes changed under the new sovereigns of the Central Middle East. In 539 BCE, Persian monarch Cyrus the Great decided to release the captives and allow them to return to Jerusalem.
What are the principal Confucian and CIT rites of passage?
Confucian tradition prescribes a full range of very detailed ritual procedures to be observed for various family, as well as a few public occasions. They differ from rites of passage in many other traditions in that they generally do not assume an overtly religious form. Confucian teaching places enormous emphasis on ritualized attentiveness to every detail of daily family life. All of that occurs within the larger presumed context of life under heaven and in a society that is at least potentially just and harmonious. In pre-modern times, many Chinese practiced rites of initiation for young women and men alike. Families conferred on young men a hat and a name symbolizing maturity. Young women received some new clothes and had their hair done specially. More recently, Chinese social custom has linked these rituals to marriage. Now considered the primary sign of adulthood.
What is the ceremony of a Japanese wedding?
Contemporary Japanese weddings are celebrated in many ways, often combining traditional Japanese and Western elements side by side. Typically, a religious wedding ceremony is performed in Shinto style at a shrine located inside the hotel where the wedding celebration occurs. The ceremony is conducted by a Shinto priest and is attended only by the couple's closest family members. The couple is purified, drinks sake, and the groom reads a statement of commitment. The ceremony ends with symbolic offerings to the kami. The couple wears traditional Japanese garb. A reception is usually held after the ceremony. The wedding couple might welcome anywhere from 15 to 250 guests, relatives, friends, and co-workers. After the bride and groom are introduced, a meal is served and brief speeches are delivered. At the end of the party, the couple thank their guests for joining them on this important day. In recent years, many Japanese couples have incorporated traditionally Western elements into their weddings, for example, brides wearing white, Christian-style dresses. Sometimes the entire ceremony takes place in a Christian church and, according to a Christian-like ritual, even when the couple is not Christian. Many couples also perform other Western-style rituals. including cake cutting, an exchange of rings, and elaborate honeymoons.
What are the feasts of the Buddha?
Buddhists in various places commemorate three important events in the Buddha's life: his birth, his enlightenment, and his entry into nirvana. Theravada Buddhists celebrate them all on the same day. Called simply Buddha Day, on the full moon day of Vaishakha, April/May. Some Mahayana groups hold separate festivities on fixed dates, with Buddha's birth observed on April 8, called Hanamatsuri in Japan. His enlightenment, called Bodhi Day, on December 8. And his final entry into nirvana on February 15. Religious activities on these occasions include special gatherings in monastery temples. Devotees bathe images of the Buddha, listen to narratives of the Buddha's life, circumambulate his relics enshrined either in large structures called chaitayas or small stupa or pagoda-shaped reliquaries, and water small Bodhi trees. Theravadins combine the festivities because tradition says that all three events occurred on the same day in different years. In Theravada Southeast Asia, Buddha Day remains associated with the onset of the monsoon rains and the planting of the rice crop.
Do Confucianism and CIT consider the practice of divination essential?
Two types of divination have been important ingredients in the ritual life of both Confucianism and CIT. As in Daoism and CCT, the practice of geomancy, earth prognostication, called Feng Shui, has always been a necessary prerequisite for the siting and planning of all structures. From the humblest home to the grandest temple or palace. Those contemplating any building project would enlist a specialist in Feng Shui for a thorough reading of the natural characteristics of the proposed site. For more detail on the practice, see the section on Daoism. In addition, people from the emperor on down regularly consulted specialists in interpreting the oracles of the Yijing, the classic of change, before undertaking any significant course of action. The imperial staff included experts in divination who could be consulted on short notice. Such specialists were not specifically members of the Literati or Confucian hierarchies, but their services were generally regarded as indispensable.
Are dance and drama equally important?
Bugaku, refined dance in 160 different styles, is often performed to the accompaniment of a gagaku ensemble and sometimes occurs in Buddhist temples as well as Shinto shrines. It is somewhat more formal and classical than Kagura, a uniquely Shinto form of liturgical dance with musical accompaniment. The name apparently derives from a term that means temporary abode of the kami. a place on earth to which worshippers summon the deities. Kagura has its mythic roots in the dance of the terrible female of heaven that lured the sun goddess to emerge from her cave. Unlike the more staid classical version danced for the emperor on December's full moon night. Shrine, or village, Kagura now reenacts often raucous scenes from mythological narratives. Several of the great shrines, such as those of Izumo, Kashiga, and Ise, are especially known for their long-standing traditions of Kagura performance. Some shrines have special structures dedicated to Kagura, but many still stage the dance in the large open space in front of the worship hall. Bon Odori is a popular form of folk dancing performed at festivals on shrine grounds. Celebrants dance around a large, raised, scaffold-like platform on which drummers and other musicians perch to play their popular Hayashi-style music. Perhaps the best known of Shinto-related dances is the dragon dance, often associated with festival parades. In shrine dances, the dragon begins by bowing to the kami and the chief priest before writhing its way across the sacred precincts. The ancient Japanese theater form called No also has roots in the reenactment of Shinto myths.
What about ordinary people incapable of such lofty feats?
They can still hope to receive an immortal body after resurrection. A belief with some similarity to classic Christian notions of bodily resurrection. Another important distinction between deist notions of salvation and, for example, Christian beliefs, is that there is no single savior figure in deist thought.
What would I see if I visited one of the surviving CIT sacred places?
Beijing's Temple of Heaven, Tiantan, is perhaps the best example of such a site. The Chinese long ago mastered the art of creating monumental public spaces, as the temple demonstrates admirably. From its southern gate to the northern wall, the complex stretches half a mile along its main ceremonial axis. The compound covers an area larger than that of the Forbidden City, about 2 miles to the north, and it is some 4 times the area of its original northern yin counterpart, the Temple of Earth. Whereas the temple compounds devoted to the feminine earth and moon are square in plan, those of heaven and sun are round-shouldered at their rear perimeters and squared off, like a large U-shape, at the opposite ends where their entry gates are located. Confucian literati concepts of hierarchy in authority structures and in family lineage are based on a patriarchal model, and are evident in these as well as most other traditional Chinese structures. As you enter the main southern gate of the Temple of Heaven and walk north, you come first to the Altar of Heaven. It is a square enclosure surrounding a circular terrace of 3 concentric tiers round heaven, surrounded by square earth, as in the overall plan of the site. The altar's symbolism includes its use of 9 courses of pavement on each of its 3 levels, 9 being the maximum level of yang energy. The posts in its surrounding railings, numbered in multiples of 9 on each level. Total 360, recalling the totality of degrees in heaven's circle. The circular hall of harvest prayer at the northern perimeter of the compound also stands within a square enclosure. Symbolizing the firmament, the triple-roofed structure stands on 2 concentric circles of 12 columns apiece. Reminders of the months of the year and the Chinese reckoning of 12 units of time per day. 4 larger central columns inside the circle symbolize the seasons. Like the altar, the hall sits atop a triple-tiered circular platform. Geometric and numerical symbolism abound.
How many different kinds of scriptural interpretation are there?
One of the most interesting and volatile areas in the study of religion involves the many ways the different religious traditions read their sacred texts. Virtually every tradition has developed a range of approaches, often applying several to the same text to bring out its various levels of meaning. Every credible interpreter starts from a basic hermeneutical principle. If you want to be true to the text, you must first know what kind of text it is.
How are Hindu religious leaders chosen and given authority?
Priesthood is generally a hereditary office, with families often tracing their sacerdotal lineages back many generations. Priests who serve in local temples are not typically members of the Brahmin caste, but their religious roles are likewise hereditary. Spiritual guides and teachers called gurus are those who rise to local or wider prominence as a result of their proficiency in various facets of religious knowledge and practical wisdom. In this instance, the classical system of training provides the equivalent of a license or seal of approval. But many famous teachers achieve wider notoriety as a result of popular acclaim. They set up shop initially, so to speak, with official sanction as products of the system. But their spiritual prowess spreads by word of mouth. Other religious figures gain prominence outside the system. An individual's reputation for holiness begins when those around him or her observe special powers or qualities, and grows as seekers gather in hopes of sharing in the wisdom and sanctity.
What other canonical texts are especially important in Confucian tradition?
A second collection called the Four Books, Su Shu, consists of very ancient texts eventually brought together during the Song dynasty, 960-1279 CE. Most famous of the four is a work commonly called the Analects, Lun Yu. a compilation of Confucius sayings and dialogues edited by second-generation disciples around 400 BCE. The Great Learning, De Shui, is a chapter excerpted from the Classic of Rites. Singled out now as a separate book because of its centrality to Confucian thought. Dating to about 350 BCE, this work is probably the single most important statement of Confucian views on the cultivation of the ideal human being, or superior person, essential to a harmonious society. Another excerpt from the Classic of Rites is now regarded as a separate book called The Doctrine of the Mean. Zhonyang, traditionally attributed to Confucius' grandson Zhusu. Its theme is the harmonious development of human nature by means of right action, and the principle of reciprocity as manifest in the 5 fundamental relationships. Finally, the Meng Zi includes the largely ethical and political teachings of Meng Zi, c. 372 to 289 BCE, commonly known as Mencius. He was one of the foundational figures in the interpretation of the classic literati themes expounded by Confucius. The book's 7 sections emphasize the need for vigilance in cultivating virtue, with the ultimate goal of living in harmony with the will, or mandate, of heaven. By about 1200 CE, the complete literati canon of texts included not only the 5 classics and the 4 books, but 4 other works considered to contain the essentials of Confucian and literati views on all things under heaven.
What gender-related issues are important for Muslims?
Muslim tradition places great emphasis on understanding and facilitating social relations according to gender-appropriate roles and religiously acceptable behavior. In some societies, women are excluded from certain occupations, but in most instances those are cultural rather than explicitly religious norms. For example, American Muslim women participate in a wider range of professions than do their sisters in some other countries. Non-Muslim American professional women may experience the same kinds of occupational limitations as their Muslim counterparts. All societies and cultures have their gender biases, and religious sanction and justification often becomes inextricably intertwined with them. Largely because religious argument can be a useful element in social control. Gender-related restrictions by which many devout Muslims abide are largely family matters, arising from the belief that God has ordained certain tasks to men and certain others to women. Gender and sex differences are real, they observe, and part of a larger plan. Traditional family life calls for a division of labor and a clear understanding of individual and collective priorities. Non-Muslims sometimes conclude that Muslim women who choose to observe a dress code are oppressed. Talk to the Muslim women, many of whom are successful physicians, lawyers, and engineers, and you get a different perspective.
Are there any other forms of religious pilgrimage?
Ziara, pronounced Zyara, meaning visitation, is a form of minor pilgrimage still popular all over the world. With a few regional exceptions such as the Arabian Peninsula. Devout Muslims travel to the tombs of holy persons to receive barakah, blessings, by association with the saint's power and holiness. Elaborate shrine complexes have grown up around some of these sacred sites. Since the 19th century especially, Muslim authorities in Saudi Arabia have sought to stamp out the practice because they have deemed the veneration of miracle-working saints a threat to pure monotheism. Ironically, Saudi Arabia remains the home of the prime example of Ziara. Each year millions of pilgrims to Mecca make a special trip north to Medina to visit the mosque in which Muhammad, his daughter Fatima, and the first caliph, Abu Bakr, are buried. Sunni Muslims from Morocco to Malaysia continue to visit secondary holy places, most of which are graves of Sufi sheikhs. Shi'i Muslims also visit sites connected with similar friends of God. But their devotional travel revolves more around a number of distinctively Shiite holy places. They are the tombs of the Imams, spiritual and biological descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima. Most of the Imams' shrines are in Iran, with its overwhelmingly Shi'i population, and southern Iraq, where most of that country's slight majority of Shiites live.
What do Christians commemorate on Holy Monday, Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday?
The Easter Triduum, 3-day period, begins with the commemoration of the evening on which Jesus gathered his apostles for the Last Supper. Maundy, from the Latin word mandatum, the new commandment of service Jesus gave his disciples then. Or Holy Thursday is marked in several churches by special rituals, some of which include a symbolic washing of the feet of several attendees by the priest or bishop. Good Friday recalls the crucifixion and death of Jesus.
Have there ever been Shinto schisms or heresies?
Several of Japan's so-called new religions have developed out of mainstream Shinto within the past 2 centuries or so. Some traditional Japanese may be inclined to regard them with suspicion, possibly even labeling them as dangerous cults. Sociologically speaking, some of these groups qualify as schismatic, that is, splinter groups, in that they have deliberately parted company with ancient Shinto tradition. Some scholars suggest that Shinto authorities coined terms such as the Emperor's Way, Kodo, and the Kami-ordained way, Kanagara no Michi, to distinguish a type of Shinto orthodoxy from a host of less correct popular and folk beliefs. But since the concept of orthodoxy has been far less important for Shinto tradition than it has for Say, some Christian or Muslim communities, the notion of heresy is largely irrelevant here.
How do Shinto practitioners deal ritually with death and mourning?
According to a saying, Shinto marries, Buddhism buries. During the Tokugawa era, 1600 to 1868, an imperial decree stipulated that only Buddhist priests should conduct funeral rites. Most cemeteries in Japan are connected to Buddhist temples rather than Shinto shrines. But there are exceptions to that general rule. And practitioners of Shinto have important beliefs and rituals concerning death and mourning. A major difference between Buddhist and Shinto practices is that Shinto rites never occur in shrines. 4 shrines are strictly dedicated to the kami. Shinto tradition regards death as a form of evil and a serious source of pollution. Shinto belief and practice has been profoundly influenced by certain Confucian attitudes toward departed ancestors. And large numbers of Japanese still perform rites of ancestor veneration. Some Japanese families still follow the practice of enshrining a deceased person's symbols in a spirit house. Tamaya, placed beneath the home's kamidana, 7 weeks after a funeral. Some of Japan's largest shrines are dedicated to memorializing the spirits of great human beings elevated to the status of kami. Grief, kibyaku, is associated with a prescribed period during which the experience of death renders family members impure. The bereaved family should stay away from shrines and refrain from Shinto ritual generally during that interval. In pre-Buddhist times, the Japanese sometimes constructed monumental memorials to the dead. Historically, lay people performed Shinto funeral rituals, with main participants wearing white. Today, Shinto rites, led by priests, occur in homes or funeral establishments. Some shrines continue to perform memorial rites for those who have died in battle.
Are there Confucian or CIT hierarchical structures?
Confucian thought discerns an essential need for hierarchies in all aspects of human society. It is a question of order. Human beings may be identical in essence, but they clearly differ in personal attributes. Talents, knowledge, and age, to name only a few distinguishing characteristics. Confucius believed that realism required taking account of those differences. Take the challenge of living an ethical life, for example. Each stage in life has its unique problems. Young people need to conquer sensuality, adults combativeness, and the elderly greed. As for the variety of human capabilities, Confucius saw 4 levels. Those who possess knowledge from birth, those capable of becoming superior persons by acquiring knowledge. Those who learn only with great effort, and those not at all disposed to learning. Confucian thinking has often been very class-conscious. The master believed that society needed stratification in order to function smoothly. At the top was the scholar, supported by the farmer who produce life's basic needs. Artisans who make practical items, merchants who buy and sell what others produce. And soldiers who, unfortunately, often wreck what others make. Within the highest echelons of the Confucian hierarchy there were still further distinctions. Until around 1530, those enshrined in Confucian memorial halls were ranked according to titles taken from imperial administration. Confucian greats were honored as king, duke, marquis, or earl, for example. After 1530, Confucians replaced those royal honorifics with the titles sage, correlate, especially learned one, worthy one, and scholar. Over the course of history, some individuals within the Confucian hierarchy have been promoted, others demoted in rank, and still others restored after being demoted. Such hierarchical adjustments have depended a great deal on ideological leanings within various imperial regimes. The last major rearrangement occurring around 1724 CIT was, of course, hierarchical, but with the emperor at the top and a much higher place allotted to the military.
Do Shinto practitioners pray in any particular language?
Since Shinto has been an exclusively Japanese phenomenon, it will come as no surprise that Shinto prayers have almost always been expressed in Japanese. That does not necessarily mean that Japanese functions as a liturgical or canonical language, as Sanskrit does in Hindu tradition or as Latin once did in Roman Catholic tradition. The role of Japanese in Shinto practice is a purely functional one. It's the vernacular language of virtually everyone associated with Shinto. There is, however, one important respect in which Japanese usage in Shinto ritual does retain the flavor of a sacred tongue. Many Shinto prayers that priests recite in shrines are quite ancient. The language and vocabulary are so archaic that only the most learned and specially trained Japanese fully understand what is being said. In that sense, the continued use of the classical language has the feel of, say, the Catholic Church's use of Latin well into the 20th century.
Is there a Shinto system of religious law?
Here have been numerous bodies of legislation concerning the structure and administration of the Shinto shrine system, and about governmental controls over the spread of religious organizations in Japan generally. Laws have decreed relationships between imperial rule and religion, and between Shinto and Buddhism, and others have stipulated conditions for religious liberty. But there has never been the kind of comprehensive codification of religious law that one finds in Islam's Sharia, Judaism's rabbinical law, or Roman Catholicism's canon law. Virtually everything related to the regulation of conduct in Shinto tradition has been integrated into an all-encompassing and very demanding, but mostly unwritten, code of ethics. People learn what is expected of them religiously through family and local community tradition.